Welcome back again. As usual, please comment down below what time it is, wherever you are right now, and press the like button. Let's get to it. In August of 1989, an entire family of 4 vanished into the night without a trace. No goodbye notes, no evidence of where they went, just silence. What could convince 2 parents to leave home in the middle of the night with their children, climbing into a stranger's pickup truck? And why, more than 3 decades later, has not a single confirmed clue surfaced about where they went? This is the story of the Jack family, and what began as hope for a new start turned into one of Canada's most haunting mysteries. Why would a family risk everything by trusting a stranger? For the Jacks, the answer is hidden in years of hardship, layers of wounds from the past, and the crushing weight of daily survival. At first glance, the choice to climb into an unknown man's truck with 2 young children seems unthinkable. But when placed within the context of their lives, the moment begins to make a tragic kind of sense. Ronald Jack grew up in British Columbia and worked hard through his early years. By the time he reached his late 20s, he was a husband and a father to 2 boys, Russell and Ryan. He was a logger, a profession many men in northern communities relied on. Logging provided steady pay, and for men like Ronald, it was also an identity. But his career ended after an injury to his back. At first, it was just pain. Then it meant lost workdays. Soon it became permanent unemployment. Jobs, suited for a man with physical limitations in that region, didn't appear often. Job boards were sparse, and companies could be selective. For Ronald, each month stretched thinner than the last. His wife, Doreen, carried her own burdens. She was a survivor of Canada's residential school system. That meant she had spent much of her childhood removed from family, language, and tradition. In those schools, Indigenous children endured strict rules, discipline, and too often, physical or sexual abuse. Doreen had lived through those experiences, and like many survivors, the memories carried forward into adulthood. Pain from the past does not vanish when someone leaves the building where it happened. It lingers, shaping how a person trusts, copes, and raises their children. Together, Ronald and Doreen navigated these difficulties while raising Russell, age 9, and Ryan, age 4. On paper, they were just another family in Prince George, a city in central British Columbia that acted as a hub for timber and industry. But inside their household, life was far from stable. Ronald's injury kept him from consistent work. Doreen's responsibilities at home left little opportunity for outside employment. Their family survived on welfare payments. At a time when social assistance carried stigma, this dependence only added to the stress. What happens when financial pressure piles on top of personal trauma? For the Jacks, the result was a family trying to stay afloat in a system that left few chances to recover. Arguments about money filtered into household life. Unexpected bills caused panic. The tasks of parenting young children layered on top. Every parent knows the demands of school clothes, packed lunches, and children's medical appointments. Without steady income, those things become battles. Ronald's frustration grew with each passing month. Not being able to support his family the way he once had weighed heavily. Friends and relatives later remembered how much he longed for a job. Even when opportunities sounded thin, he wanted to believe in them. The idea of steady pay, meals for the children, and perhaps even the pride of returning home with money in his pocket was powerful. Desperation can reshape judgment. When the only alternative seems to be sinking deeper into poverty, people sometimes hold on to fragile hopes. Meanwhile, Doreen carried the invisible stress of living with her trauma. The past was never far away, and when combined with the harsh realities of present day, it created a family environment steeped in pressure. For their children, Russell and Ryan, life was coloured by this constant tension. They were loved, but they were part of a household running on the fumes of survival. Trust is complicated in such situations. On one hand, years of hardship can make people wary. On the other, when a possible solution appears, even in the most unlikely form, the hope for change can override caution. For Ronald and Doreen, a stranger with a proposal was not simply another man in town. He represented freedom from endless waiting, from the constant calculations of which bill to pay first, or how to stretch groceries through the week. It is important to understand that this was not just about finances. Emotional exhaustion compounds financial stress. When someone feels cornered, with no practical path forward, risky decisions begin to look reasonable. Ronald and Doreen were not careless parents making reckless choices. They were individuals weighed down by a cycle of unemployment, systemic barriers, and the exhaustion of trying to break free. By the summer of 1989, they were searching for hope in any form it arrived. Imagine the moment. A man offers Ronald an opportunity. The description plays directly into their needs: good pay, housing, the ability to bring both children along, even daycare provided at the site. It sounded designed to ease every single obstacle standing in their way. For Ronald, unable to secure steady work for months, the words must have been intoxicating. For Doreen, the chance to leave behind the grind of Prince George and step into something supportive may have been the relief she longed for. Viewed with hindsight, it is tempting to say they should have been suspicious. But survival looks different when you are caught inside it. Offers that appear suspicious to outsiders can sound like miracles to those living without options. This was not simply a new job. It was a full solution. Shelter, childcare, income, everything missing from their daily lives, tied together in one promise. And so, when the offer arrived in that Prince George pub, it was not taken lightly. It was weighed against years of disappointment, against the strain of unemployment and the echo of Doreen's childhood experiences. It was compared against the ache of Ronald's injury and the endless welfare paperwork. If they turned it down, what waited for them? More months of the same frustrations. Viewed through that lens, trusting a stranger seemed like less of a gamble and more of a necessity. The Jack family were not prepared for what was to come. To them, the stranger seemed like a lifeline. In reality, it was the beginning of an ordeal that left them missing from history. That night, Ronald and Doreen's calculated hope allowed them to accept an offer. And in their minds, the decision was not reckless at all. It was the only path forward. But who exactly offered them this lifeline? How could one brief encounter seal a family's fate? On the night of August 1st, 1989, Ronald Jack spent his evening at the First Litra pub in Prince George, a place where many locals gathered after long days. That night may have started like many others, but it quickly shifted into something that would change his family's future forever. At some point during the evening, Ronald met a man no one would later be able to identify. Witnesses remembered the stranger as tall, heavy-set, with reddish-brown hair and a full beard. He carried himself with confidence, but he was not familiar around town. People came and went through Prince George, especially in jobs tied to logging or mining, so an unfamiliar face was not unusual. But this man had more than conversation to offer. He claimed he could change Ronald's situation with a new job, good wages, and stability that had been out of reach for months. The stranger described work at a camp near Cluckel's Lake. It was set up like the type of project common in British Columbia in the late 1980s. Logging camps, small-scale construction jobs, and contracts in remote settings often pulled men away from home for weeks at a time. Men would work long shifts, live in camp housing, and earn enough to keep their families going between jobs. For Ronald, whose back injury limited job options, the appeal was clear. This was presented as camp work that did not simply employ him. It supported his entire family. According to the man, housing would be available, meals covered, and, most unusually, daycare for the children. That detail set this proposal apart. Daycare facilities were not a standard benefit in remote camps. A promise like that would have been rare. For the Jacks, it touched directly on their needs. Ronald and Doreen often had to juggle childcare while managing their financial struggles. A safe option for Russell and Ryan while they stayed near their father's worksite must have sounded like a relief. This meant Ronald could work without worrying about leaving his family behind or searching for babysitting arrangements. It looked like every obstacle had been anticipated and solved inside this single offer. Still, some people might have questioned the deal. A stranger at a bar with promises that sounded almost too precise. A new camp, unknown to locals. The timing of the meeting. Every element had marks of risk attached. Yet when someone has been searching unsuccessfully for work for months, doubts can be replaced by the hope that maybe, finally, luck has shifted. Ronald might have noticed the unusual details, but what weighed heavier for him was the possibility of shaking loose from the routine of poverty and hopelessness. There is also the setting to consider. A bar is often a place where men share stories, trade information, and make connections. In small or mid-sized towns, work opportunities sometimes traveled this way, from word of mouth rather than formal postings. If someone claimed to know a foreman looking to hire, it did not always sound strange. For Ronald, the location reinforced possibility rather than suspicion. Witnesses confirmed that the man and Ronald spent time together at the pub that evening. The conversation lasted long enough to provide detailed terms. The pay was said to be higher than other local opportunities. The camp provided housing close to the job site. The possibility for Doreen to stay with him made it appear like a family-centered arrangement. Ronald did not dismiss it. He listened, then agreed. By all accounts, there was no sign of hesitancy by the end of the conversation. The psychology of the moment is important. Desperation can widen trust. When almost every door seems closed, the one that opens, even slightly, often appears brighter than it really is. The Jacks had lived on welfare, faced injuries, and endured barriers common for indigenous families in British Columbia at the time. Under those circumstances, the risk of trusting a stranger may not have felt like much of a risk at all. It may have felt like the only rational choice left. The man gave enough detail to make the offer sound plausible, but not so much that others could later confirm it. Whether by design or coincidence, he set terms in vague but attractive language. Cluckul's Lake, a known location outside Prince George, added credibility. Most people had heard of camps in such areas, but nothing about the specific site could be verified afterward. Ronald accepted. He did not go home to debate the choice for weeks. He did not search for second opinions. According to those close to the family, Ronald made the decision that very night. He told the man he and his family would join him. The stranger had a pickup truck ready. They would leave that evening, heading toward the supposed job site. This quick transition from offer to acceptance shows how powerful the promise had been. For Ronald, time was not a luxury. The family's situation required change now, not in months. The security of work outweighed suspicion. Within a matter of hours, the family's course was set. Looking back today, everything about the moment becomes more haunting. The physical description of the man, though detailed, has never led to a confirmed suspect. His large build, reddish-brown hair, and beard are the only clear identifiers known. The offer of camp work, though attractive, left no paperwork or employment records to follow. Every aspect of that short conversation acted as a launch point for something terrible, yet left behind almost nothing concrete to investigate. How did a chance encounter in a pub transform into the erasure of an entire family? That is the chilling part of this story. One evening, one meeting, one agreement. The stranger offered stability, but instead, he became associated with disappearance. By closing time, Ronald had accepted. The Jacks prepared to travel with him before dawn, eager to step into what they believed was a brighter chapter. Instead, it would be the last decision recorded before 4 people vanished from their community without explanation. Now that the deal was struck, what unfolded in the hours that followed would be even more troubling. What happened in those final hours before they climbed into the truck? Late on the night of August 1st, 1989, inside the modest Jack household, the family began gathering their belongings. Clothes were pulled together, small items were packed, and the movement carried an air of both excitement and urgency. It was not the gradual collection of possessions seen before a vacation. This was quick, deliberate, and late enough that neighbours might not have even noticed. The suddenness suggested the offer Ronald had accepted earlier in the evening was not a distant plan, but something already in motion. Ronald demonstrated that this job opportunity was not just talk when he picked up the phone and called his brother. In the quiet hours of the night, he asked if childcare could be arranged. To some, this might seem unusual given the supposed arrangement was that daycare would be available at the camp. But Ronald's call indicated he was serious enough about the plan to prepare a backup. It also showed that he had internalized the offer and begun fitting it into the family's real needs, a step that moves any idea from possibility into reality. Calls like this reinforced that Ronald had not simply told Doreen about the stranger's pitch. He was taking active steps to line up a new beginning. Another phone call added a strange layer to the night. Sometime before leaving, Ronald reached out to his mother. The words he used were vague, almost puzzling. It was the kind of call that revealed little detail, but conveyed that some change was coming. For his mother, who was used to his struggles, the late-night timing and cryptic tone may have been unsettling. With hindsight, the call took on the weight of a farewell, though at the time it may have sounded more like an update without clarity. Those words became one of the last direct traces of Ronald's voice. Meanwhile, inside the home, both parents prepared Russell, 9 years old, and Ryan, only 4. Packing for children often includes small but important essentials: favorite clothing, items for comfort, perhaps school materials, if they expected to be away for long. Witnesses later recalled that the family appeared eager, as if heading to something promising, rather than weighed down in dread. The children were dressed, belongings sorted, and the atmosphere was hurried but not panicked. That distinction mattered to relatives who saw them. This was not a family fleeing an emergency. This was a family setting out with purpose, convinced the offer to relocate was safe. The quick pace of their actions showed a trust in the opportunity that had been placed before them. No one tried to stop them. Those around the Jacks viewed the decision as a chance at stability, one that could help both parents recover financially and allow the children to have more secure lives. In families where every dollar counted, new work possibilities often inspired encouragement rather than warnings. Those watching the departure may have worried, but they also understood why Ronald and Doreen would take the risk. The unusual part was the timing. Families do not often set out for a new life in the middle of the night, but when a ride is offered and conditions are set by someone else, there is less room for negotiation. The stranger from the pub was the driver. He controlled not only the introduction to the new job, but also the travel timetable. If he insisted they leave after dark, the Jacks would have to agree. And they did. Whether because of urgency on his part or simple coincidence, it meant the Jacks' final hours in their community were marked by quick packing, brief phone calls, and late-night activity. The pickup truck arrived. Witnesses described the vehicle, but decades later, those details were never enough to conclusively identify it. Ronald loaded his family into the stranger's vehicle. This moment, the crossing of the threshold from home into an unfamiliar truck, cemented the point at which the Jacks became vulnerable beyond measure. Once the doors closed, their control was limited. They were no longer in their house where relatives might check on them. They were not in a public space like the pub, where others might watch. They were isolated inside a vehicle, in transit toward an unknown site. It is chilling, in hindsight, to note how ordinary the departure seemed. Families leave town for work sites all the time. In central British Columbia, it is part of the rhythm of life. One week a father is home, the next he is at a camp. Mothers, children, and pickup trucks moving between towns was familiar. Nothing outwardly signaled danger. That may be why none of those who witnessed the departure insisted they stay behind. To them, this was not the last time they would see the Jacks alive. It was just another goodbye, but this was the last time. Every detail afterward faded to silence. No further phone calls, no letters or paychecks from a camp, no return visits to Prince George. The stranger and the family that climbed into his truck left together, and by morning, they were gone. All future searches would trace their absence back to this single moment, this late-night ride out of the city. The urgency of the packing, the cryptic call to Ronald's mother, and the trust placed into an arrangement that seemed slightly too perfect now sit as red flags. At the time, they were pieces of a puzzle that seemed to finally come together for the Jacks. To their relatives, it was cause for cautious hope. To a community familiar with economic struggle, it was understandable. But to history, it became the final act of a family before their lives vanished into mystery. Every missing person case has a point where the trail drops off. For the Jacks, it was the moment their home fell silent and the truck drove them away. All past difficulty and all future uncertainty intersected in those final hours. It was the last time their presence was verifiable, the final hours before speculation would begin. Their departure sealed their disappearance in one undeniable way. The family, once visible and present in their lives, had entered a chapter that no one around them could follow. The pickup truck symbolized transition, but instead of work and security, it carried the Jacks into disappearance. But the aftermath would make the mystery even stranger. How could a family vanish within hours of leaving their home? The night of August 1st, 1989, provided the setting for the Jacks' final known movements. They had packed their belongings, spoken of new work, and stepped into a stranger's vehicle. From that moment, details dissolve into silence. Their departure marked the shift from hope to mystery, as one decision carried them beyond the reach of everyone who knew them. The vehicle waiting outside their home was said to be a pickup truck. The driver was described as large, heavy-set, with reddish-brown hair and a beard. His offer of opportunities at a camp near Clukil's Lake had been convincing enough to lead Ronald, Doreen, and their two sons to join him almost immediately. The family had no car of their own. That detail is important because it meant they had no control over their transportation. The man at the wheel decided the route, the timing, and the destination. The Jacks were not able to follow in their own vehicle, nor could they leave halfway through the journey. Their reliance on the stranger placed every outcome in his hands. The roads, stretching out from Prince George toward Clukil's Lake, were familiar to many at the time. They wound through forests and smaller communities, the kind of highways where weary drivers often passed with little notice of who else shared the road. But when analysing the Jacks' disappearance, those roads also became the stage for speculation. Could anyone have seen the pickup that night? Did someone pass a vehicle carrying a family without realising its significance? If so, those fleeting glances were never transformed into leads. No recorded sightings made it into case files. No travellers remembered the vehicle, and no community along the way reported the sudden arrival of Ronald and Doreen at a campsite. That lack of contact became noticeable very quickly. Friends and family, who had been told the Jacks were leaving, assumed they would check in. A call after arrival, a letter describing the camp, or news of pay from Ronald's first days of work. But those updates never came. In missing person cases, silence is usually gradual. Messages might trail off, or communication shifts become apparent over weeks. For the Jacks, silence began instantly. By the morning after their departure, no calls or visits arrived. Perfect, quiet, settled. A silence so abrupt that it marked the night as an ending. The supposed camp job has stood at the center of the puzzle ever since. Ronald had described it to those he spoke with that evening. He mentioned Clukil's Lake, the pay, the benefits, and the daycare placement for his children. Yet no camp fitting that description was ever identified in records or through later interviews. Investigators searched for such a location, but discovered no evidence it existed. Was the camp fabricated? Was the story simply bait designed to reassure Ronald and Doreen? These questions have followed the case as theories emerged. Advocates and investigators remain split between believing the camp was a real but untraceable operation, or that the stranger's words were fiction. Rural British Columbia contained many camps in that period. Jobs were sometimes recorded informally, shifts arranged by connections rather than paperwork. It is possible that Ronald assumed inconsistency in records was normal. For an unemployed man seeking employment, the promise of any site might have seemed enough, but the missing paperwork and lack of witnesses from that supposed camp raised red flags after the family vanished. People living near Clukil's Lake did not recall a camp hiring parents with young children. Opportunities in those areas often demanded long hours in difficult conditions without accommodation for families. That contradiction strengthens the idea that the camp could have been entirely fictitious. Consider how unusual the offer actually was. Employment camps rarely invited families to live on site. They were structured for workers only, to keep costs low and focus on productivity. The daycare feature stood apart from industry norms, almost designed to win over Ronald and Doreen by resolving their specific concerns. If it was a fabricated detail, it served its purpose well. This absence of confirmation sits alongside the eerie gap left in their community. No one reported seeing Ronald, Doreen, or the boys at local stores after that night. Hospitals and service accounts did not record them. Welfare offices received no follow-ups. Schools did not see Russell return for the fall term. It was as if the family's lives had been erased the moment the pickup pulled away. Families often leave towns for work, but there are usually phone calls, notes, or sightings. In this case, there was complete erasure. The long roads extending from Prince George to the surrounding countryside became the backdrop for theories. Those highways ran through isolated terrain. At night, traffic thinned out until stretches could be travelled without passing another car for miles. For anyone driving after dark, options opened for small stops or detours unnoticed by others. Did the man in the pickup take the Jacks to a real camp but never follow through with the promised arrangements? Or did he never intend to go near Clukil's Lake at all? Once on those roads, his choices were obscured by geography and timing. Looking back at the timeline, the moment of disappearance comes down to hours. They left at night. By sunrise in northern British Columbia, families are usually awake, children readying for summer routines, parents preparing for the day. But for the Jacks, morning arrived without their presence. Their house was empty. Their relatives were waiting but heard nothing. An entire family had crossed into absence in less than half a day. It is chilling to think of how fast it happened. Neighbours may have still been asleep when the truck drove away. Relatives awoke, thinking the Jacks were on their way toward a new opportunity, not realising they had already faded from contact. That contrast makes the timing feel sharper. 1 hour they were a struggling but present family in Prince George. The next morning, they existed only as questions. By the time concern grew, the trail was already cold. No records verified Ronald's employment. No camp employer in the Clukil's Lake region stepped forward. No receipts, no confirmed truck descriptions beyond what witnesses provided, and no contact from the family themselves. It left investigators with an empty gap stretching from the pickup outside their home into the endless landscape surrounding Prince George. The disappearance of an individual often sparks quick questions, but the disappearance of 4, parents and young children at once, stands apart in scale and mystery. This larger vanishing sat heavily on their community. Families expected to hear noises of children playing, updates from Ronald and Doreen, yet all of it was cut short. By morning, they were gone without a trace. That silence has carried forward through decades, shaping one of Canada's most enduring mysteries. Authorities soon entered the picture, but made mistakes that would haunt the investigation. Did the first police mistakes cost the family's only chance of being found? The disappearance of the Jack family was reported within days of their quiet departure. At that point, it still seemed possible that they were safe somewhere, waiting for contact or preparing to send word back. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police began their investigation in early August 1989, but what unfolded next confused the public and created mistrust that has lasted decades. Only days into the search, authorities made an astonishing error. They publicly announced that Ronald, Doreen, and the children had been located. The news spread quickly. The family was safe, the case closed, and there was no reason for community alarm. But it was not true. The announcement proved false, and investigators had to retract their statement. By then, the damage was already done. With their disappearance falsely resolved, attention faded at a critical time. The first days in any missing persons case matter most. Leads are fresh, memories are sharper, and sightings can be more easily confirmed. By closing the case prematurely, investigators allowed that early energy to disappear. The retraction caused confusion among the public and created delays in gathering information. Some who might have stepped forward with accounts of the family's last hours assumed the matter had been settled. Others doubted later appeals for help, unsure whether the RCMP were committed to pursuing the matter seriously. For Indigenous families in particular, who were already well aware of unequal treatment from authorities, this error looked like something far more serious than a mistake. It looked like a sign that their community members did not receive the same urgency as others. The premature closure also meant that valuable hours passed without full investigative effort. Family and neighbours could have been approached more quickly. Witnesses at the pub might have recalled sharper details just days after the meeting with the stranger. Routes toward Cluquil's Lake might have offered traces if searched at once. Instead, the investigation restarted from a weakened position, with time already lost. The police tried to recover momentum, but it was much harder now to regain the community trust that had vanished with the false announcement. The investigation leaned on media support to spread awareness. Crime Stoppers produced reenactments of the Jack family's last days, broadcasting segments on television to reach new audiences. These dramatizations were a tool often used in that period, meant to jog memory and encourage the public to call with tips. Viewers saw versions of Ronald meeting the stranger in the pub, the family preparing for a hopeful departure, and then leaving in the pickup truck. For families of the missing, these reenactments were both painful and useful. They placed the loved ones back into the public eye and made the story harder to forget. But even this media push contained serious limitations. The broadcasts did not reach into the very region where the camp had supposedly been located. Cluquil's Lake, the target destination named by the man in the pub, sat outside the broadcast area. That meant people living near the area most connected to the story may never have seen the reenactments. Locals who might have driven those roads or lived near possible sites went unexposed to the reconstructions. The mismatch reduced the already narrow chances of catching new leads. At the community level, fear and frustration grew. Families in Prince George, particularly Indigenous families, watched as days turned into weeks without clear progress. The Jack family had not returned. No contact came from Ronnie or Doreen. Even their welfare payments stopped without use. Yet the police response appeared to lack urgency. In other cases across Canada, white families often saw immediate, intensive campaigns. Helicopters, roadblocks, and widespread media calls for action appeared quickly. Here, locals noticed the pace was different. The weight of unresolved residential school trauma and ongoing societal prejudice influenced how Indigenous families viewed this delay. It was not simply a bureaucratic issue, it was another reminder of injustice. Parents across the community felt the unease. If an entire family could vanish without trace, who was safe? But while families whispered about danger and possible foul play, the official posture lagged behind. The delay allowed skepticism to creep deep into the case. People wondered if police believed the Jacks might have simply chosen to move on. Questions circulated about whether the disappearance was treated like abandonment rather than abduction. Authorities offered limited public reassurances, further fueling the distrust. By the end of the first year, no suspects were in custody, no sites excavated, and no strong evidence recovered. Witness statements provided a general description of the man at the bar, but no name was ever attached. Without momentum, the case drifted. Fear hardened into cynicism, especially within Indigenous circles. They saw the Jack story lined up beside many other missing and murdered Indigenous cases, trapped in cycles of slow responses and limited accountability. The emotional distance between the community and investigators became another obstacle. Families and friends of the Jacks wanted answers, but trust in the RCMP had eroded. Some chose not to share information or dismissed new appeals. Others continued pressing the case in local discussions, unwilling to let it disappear from memory even as official action slowed. For those most connected, the limits of law enforcement added to the wider grief. It was not only that their loved ones were missing, it was that the people tasked with protecting them seemed unwilling or unable to give their situation equal standing. The investigation tried to adapt by using available tools, flyers, public bulletins, and calls for tips repeated over the years. But with the earliest days lost to confusion, momentum waned each time. By the mid-1990s, the Jax's case was cold. The crime scene, if one existed, had never been documented. The man from the pub remained only a sketch. The pickup truck, a common vehicle in northern towns, was never identified. Almost nothing tangible remained except the deep wound of the family's absence. Yet the community never completely stopped watching. Newspaper articles and small reports appeared occasionally to remind the public of the story. Families continued to press for acknowledgement. Activists pointed to the case as an example of how Indigenous people were failed by systemic indifference. They argued that if mistakes in the first days had not occurred, or if urgency had matched the scale of the disappearance, perhaps the Jax disappearance would not have become another cold file. Distrust in the RCMP's commitment to finding answers grew as years passed. The early blunders were never forgotten. Many held the belief that those initial errors may have permanently sealed off opportunities for discovery. Each time a lead was missed, every year without progress, reinforced the sense of neglect. The investigation had begun too late, too weak, and never recovered. But years later, an anonymous call would carry chilling claims. Could one cryptic call have solved everything? For years, the disappearance of the Jack family had produced more questions than answers. Leads had gone quiet, tips had fizzled out, and no trace of Ronald, Doreen, Russell, or Ryan was discovered. Then, nearly 7 years after they vanished, something unexpected broke the silence. On January 28, 1996, an anonymous voice reached the RCMP late in the evening with information startling enough to reignite hope. The caller claimed to know where the Jack family could be found. The words, simple and direct, suggested the four had been killed and buried at the south end of a ranch. Seconds later, the line went dead. That was all. No names, no directions, no follow-up. For the investigators who answered the call, those few words carried immense weight. The Jack family's disappearance was by then a painful case that hung heavy over the Prince George area. The possibility that someone might have information specific enough to give a burial site sent shockwaves through the investigative team. But because the caller hung up before clarifying which ranch, where it was located, or how they knew the information, the tip was both charged with promise and almost impossible to act upon. The RCMP attempted to trace the call. Phone records tied it back to a residence in Vanderhoof, a small community west of where the Jacks had lived. But that address did not belong to anyone connected directly to the family or their disappearance. When investigators followed up, they discovered the call had been placed during a house party. Those inside claimed they had no idea who really made the call, whether it was a guest in attendance, someone borrowing the phone, or even a person using the home without permission. No clear answer emerged. The lead, that had sounded like a breakthrough, dissolved into another dead end, clouded by noise, excuses, and uncertainty. The question then became simple but impossible to ignore. Was the anonymous tip legitimate, or was it just another cruel distraction? Investigators had to weigh the content carefully. The fact that the caller used the phrase, "the south end of a ranch," suggested specificity. It was not vague in the way that many hoaxes are. It did not say out in the woods or buried somewhere near Prince George. It pointed to a ranch, a geographic marker, and a directional cue. That sort of detail looked like insider knowledge to some, but because the caller provided nothing beyond that short phrase, no one knew whether it was an honest glimpse into the truth or a rehearsed piece of misinformation. As weeks passed with no further calls and no one stepping forward, authorities made the decision to release the audio of the tip to the public. By airing the recording, they hoped someone might recognize the voice, the tone, or even the way the words were phrased. It was not common for police to give out the sound of a call like this. Doing so indicated both their desperation and their belief that the caller was real enough to warrant recognition. The release attracted attention from locals across British Columbia, and people speculated endlessly about whose voice was on the tape. Yet public distribution still did not reveal the identity of the caller. The use of the word ranch also became a decades-long point of tension. Residents combed through their knowledge of the region. Which ranch could have matched the description? Vanderhoof had nearby farmland, as did communities along Highway 16, The southern portions of some ranches extended into remote and wooded terrain. Searching these areas without direct coordinates was nearly impossible. To this day, many believe that the phrase, "south end of a ranch," remains one of the most haunting details in the entire disappearance. It carried enough precision to light curiosity, but not enough to be useful in practice. The speculation deepened when considering motives. If the caller knew the truth, why would they end the call before giving specifics? Fear is one possibility. Perhaps the person worried that giving full details might expose them to retaliation. If they had first-hand involvement, the need to remain hidden would have been even stronger. Another theory suggested it was not someone directly linked to the crime, but an individual who had overheard details at a party or in a conversation years earlier. In that case, their nervousness could have caused them to abandon the call out of panic. There was also a darker explanation, that the entire call was a hoax meant only to toy with investigators and the family suffering in absence. Each possibility has remained unresolved. 7 years had passed since the Jacks were last seen when the call came. In that vast stretch of time, their file had become one of many open cases, but nothing else across those years had carried the potential weight of this anonymous voice. Every word was analysed. Every possible ranch was speculated. Families in the region whispered about whether the caller had been sitting on vital information all along. Others believed the scarceness of details proved it was a lie. Without further communication, no one could confirm. The RCMP considered the tip important enough to keep it alive. It remained in their case notes and was cited each time the disappearance resurfaced in headlines or community discussions. The law enforcement argument leaned on the possibility that revealing the caller could, in one stroke, explain everything. Identifying the person who used that phone in Vanderhoof might either validate the story of the ranch or disprove it as a fabrication. The importance of that moment has not lessened even decades after the call was placed. Even now, residents discuss the ranch tip in almost mythical terms. It became the kind of rumor that circulates in small towns for years. Community members still pass theories back and forth. A forgotten property, an unsearched pasture, or a lost clue hidden under soil that has since been ploughed over. Without evidence to confirm it, the sentence, "the south end of a ranch," continues to hang heavy, not as resolution, but as suggestion. The caller's words remain suspended between truth and fiction, their impact magnified because they never returned with clarification. Over time, the lack of discovery surrounding the tip has overshadowed the once electric hope it produced. Families connected to the Jacks grew frustrated each year. No action resulted. Activists and indigenous advocates pointed out how haunting it was that even when clear details emerged, systemic barriers seemed to halt effective follow-up. Was more pressure required to thoroughly investigate ranchlands at the time? Did law enforcement fully commit to chasing every acre down? The open questions festered into renewed criticism. To this day, the call remains the single most tantalizing but inconclusive lead connected to the Jack family. It embodies both what the case has and what it lacks. It offers specificity but not certainty. It dangles a possible site but never gives a path to find it. For investigators, the caller was like a shadow, slipping into a room, speaking just enough to draw attention before disappearing entirely. The voice captured on that recording still waits for recognition. The result is that an entire community continues to live with what-ifs. What if that call was the absolute truth? What if someone had stayed on the line long enough to lead police toward confirmation? What if, buried beneath acres of ranchland, the Jacks could have been recovered? Without answers, those questions continue to stretch across decades. The anonymity solidified the frustration, leaving the case twisting between closure and permanent uncertainty. The family's fate remained hidden. The tip burned brightly and then went out just as quickly, fading into 7 seconds of recorded words. 7 seconds that could have provided everything but ended with nothing. Despite this tip, the official search dragged on. Did investigators ever narrow down a real suspect? In the years after the Jack family disappeared, the central figure of interest remained the same: the unidentified man whom Ronald met at the pub. Witnesses gave police a clear physical description. He was said to be tall, heavy-set, with reddish-brown hair and a beard. His appearance stuck in people's memories, enough for officers to produce a sketch. Yet despite the detail, that sketch never led to a name. No one in Prince George, Vanderhoof, or the surrounding towns could confirm knowing a man who fit it exactly. The man seemed to appear one night, make his offer, and dissolve back into the crowds without leaving a trail. The lack of identity for this man created a constant challenge for investigators. Without a name, they could not cross-check employment records, property files, or even confirm whether he had ties to a camp at Klukel's Lake. The fact that he was described so clearly but never identified carries two difficult implications. Either he was truly unknown to the community, a traveler passing through, or he had deeper connections that were successfully hidden. Both directions left investigators circling the same dead ends, without clear progress forward. As the years went on, other names began to enter discussions, not through police confirmations, but through rumours in the community. British Columbia in the 1990s saw an increase in awareness about serial killers operating in Western Canada. When infamous figures like Robert Pickton were exposed, people began to connect them to any unsolved disappearance. Because the Jack family's case remained in the news, it became a target for speculation. Was the man at the pub connected to these broader crimes? Was their ending tied not to a personal promise gone wrong, but to larger patterns of predation and violence? Members of the Jack family urged people not to attach their disappearance to serial killer folklore. They emphasized that speculation did little to aid the real search for truth. The stranger who met Ronald had been described by witnesses and formed the core of the case. To pull focus away from him toward other notorious names risked burying the specific clues that might one day lead to discovery. Their reminder spoke to a larger tension in unsolved cases. It is easy for communities and even media to chase recognizable villains, but that focus can obscure local realities. Theories continued to multiply without evidence to support them. Some believed the offer of work at Clukil's Lake was genuine, but had collapsed into tragedy once the Jacks were there. Others believed the camp was a fabrication, invented to lure the family into isolation where no one could witness what followed. There was speculation about roadside violence, about opportunistic crime, and even about organized exploitation. Each theory had followers, but no one provided the concrete proof needed to elevate them above rumor. The police pursued many of these leads when they could. In the later years of the investigation, they interviewed people around Prince George and Vanderhoof who might have seen a man matching the description. They followed up tips that connected ranch properties, private landowners, and logged tracts of forest to the family. In some cases, they brought in radar equipment to search beneath soil for signs of graves. These efforts showed that authorities did not abandon the case entirely. However, radar sweeps and interviews produced nothing to tie back to Ronald, Doreen, or their sons. Searches ended, files closed, the land turned quiet again. The difficulty grew each time an effort ended without progress. Every property checked and cleared removed one possible resolution, but it also highlighted the sheer scope of the area still untouched. British Columbia's landscape is vast. Ranch properties stretch for miles. Logging areas rise and fall in remote hills where few outsiders travel. To suggest the family could be anywhere inside those hundreds of miles was to admit how slim the odds of recovery had become. The weight of uncertainty overshadowed official action. For every statement describing the mystery man at the pub, there were 3 rumors about other criminals. For every police sweep of land, there were 10 conversations in town about where else they might be. The abundance of theories created noise. With so many competing views, no single lead shone brighter than the rest. Investigators were left trying to listen through a wall of speculation, a task that often left them repeating the same steps, without new breakthroughs. Another challenge was time itself. Every year that passed allowed memories to weaken. Witnesses at the pub the night Ronald spoke to, the man could no longer recall details with the same clarity. A shirt colour remembered at the time blurred into uncertainty a decade later. A license plate that might have been written down in 1989 would not be recalled cleanly by 1999. The erosion of memory eroded evidence too. Even new property searches decades later faced the complication of disturbed soil, changed landmarks, or erased tracks. The longer the case lasted, the colder it became. Communities around the Highway 16 corridor, later labelled the Highway of Tears, recognised how typical this frustration had become. Families reported loved ones missing. Police responded with early actions, but without quick results, cases grew crowded by rumour. The Jack disappearance suffered the same cycle. By remaining unsolved, it became folded into wider conversations about serial violence, systemic failures, and community fear. Throughout the speculation, one consistent fact weighed against any broader theory. The entire chain of events led back to the man at the pub. He was the last confirmed contact. He provided the explanation for why the Jacks left home. He controlled their departure and was the final outsider to see them alive. Regardless of how many rumours developed over the years, no piece of speculation moved the case forward beyond him. The investigation circled again and again around this man, but with no name, no confirmed camp, and no recovery, it never broke through that limitation. For the Jack family's relatives, this central truth was infuriating. They did not have to speculate about predators far away or notorious names in the headlines. Their loved ones were last seen climbing into a stranger's pickup truck. All resolution started there and ended there. Theories outside that moment often distracted from the search for accountability. Yet because real evidence was lacking, those distractions gained ground, and the frustration grew. The Jack family's disappearance is remembered as an unsolved crime tied not to excessive detail, but to lack of it. Everything known points toward one man described in a pub, a drive toward Klukel's Lake, and silence. Beyond speculation, that is all investigators truly have. For decades, they attempted to knock down other rumors, attempted to search land and review files, but the circle always closed back to that single stranger. The tension between rumors, theories, and the void of evidence meant the case stayed trapped in uncertainty. Other names came and went across years of speculation. Wider theories added volume, but not clarity. At the center remained the one man no one could identify, the ghostly figure said to be large, bearded, and persuasive enough to seal an entire family's fate in one night. And so the case circled endlessly around him, never stepping past speculation. If anyone knows his name, they never came forward. If anyone suspected the true location of the Jacks, they never proved it. That gap continues to define the investigation. Yet the greater tragedy did not sit only in mystery. It reached beyond one stranger and became tied to much broader violence in the region. Why does this case stand out among dozens of vanishings? The answer lies in where it happened and the larger story it joins. Highway 16 cuts across northern British Columbia, stretching hundreds of miles through forests, rivers, and small communities. For decades it has been known by another name, the Highway of Tears. That name carries a heavy weight because along that corridor, many Indigenous people, most often women and girls, have gone missing. Their disappearances formed a troubling pattern that families and advocates have pressed governments to acknowledge for years. The vast distances, scarce resources, and systemic neglect created an environment where people were vulnerable, and too often those vulnerabilities were ignored. The Jack family's disappearance sits inside this legacy, but it also stands apart. When Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan vanished in 1989, it echoed stories that communities were already whispering about. Indigenous women who had relied on hitchhiking were disappearing along stretches of the highway. Some were last seen waiting for rides at the edge of rural roads. Others were traveling between small towns for school, work, or family visits. Families reported them missing, but many cases received limited investigation, leaving entire groups of people to wonder if authorities valued their lives with the same urgency as others. In time, law enforcement admitted that dozens of these disappearances shared ties to Highway 16. Researchers and advocates later pointed to poor transportation systems, isolation, systemic racism, and economic stress as the underlying conditions that shaped this crisis. The Jack family's case might not have fit the pattern in the same way. They were not lone travelers, young teenagers, or women accepted into the growing list maintained by advocates. They were a household, living together in what looked like a structured plan. Both parents wanted to accept work at a camp, and they were traveling with their children in the vehicle of a stranger. Their situation removed the element of hitchhiking alone, but instead of separating them from the wider conversation, this difference actually brought attention to the deeper patterns of neglect and danger connected to Highway 16. The disappearance of 4 family members at once made people stop and take notice. If individuals could vanish along the highway without clear answers, that was troubling enough. But an entire family disappearing without trace exposed how fragile safety really was in northern communities. It suggested that vulnerability did not only attach to single women in difficult positions, it extended to parents and children, to whole households, to anyone who found themselves dependent on strangers. The Jacks were not hitchhiking by choice, they lacked a car, and in rural British Columbia at the time, that meant their only way to new opportunities was through someone else's vehicle. That reliance was not unusual. Many Indigenous residents facing unemployment and economic strain shared the same conditions. It showed that what happened to them was not isolated bad luck, but part of a broader web of risks left unaddressed. The physical environment of Highway 16 made the situation even more severe. Communities sit far apart, separated by long stretches of road with no safe rest stops, gas stations, or public facilities for miles. People trying to move between those towns often had no bus lines or affordable transportation. Hitchhiking became the practical, if dangerous, solution. Alongside those realities was the lack of infrastructure set up to protect travelers. Few phone lines, sparse police presence, and the difficulty of searching through dense forest meant that once someone vanished, it was almost impossible to retrace their path. These conditions were well known, families had raised concerns for years, yet transportation systems remained limited. The Jacks lived inside these conditions. Economic strain placed them at the edge of survival. As an indigenous family, they lived with the compounding history of systemic racism and trauma. Their decision to accept the stranger's offer was influenced by desperation, but their reliance on that truck ride also linked them to the broader dangers others already faced on or around Highway 16. In this way, even though their disappearance did not follow the most common profile, it became an example that the crisis was broader than first believed. Entire families could be caught in it, not just individual women. Advocates later pointed to their case as symbolic within the Highway of Tears narrative. Dozens of indigenous women disappeared along that pathway, but the Jack family showed a different possibility: vulnerability at a household level. Doreen had survived the painful experiences of residential school, a structure that removed children from parents and disrupted communities for generations. That system's legacy lingered in indigenous families across the province. Combined with poverty, unemployment, and trauma, those legacies created openings for exploitation. When a stranger offered Ronald the prospect of work that would care for the whole family, it tied into every need they carried. Their agreement to leave home that night was not random. It was the consequence of being left with limited options in a system already failing their community. The wider injustices in the Highway of Tears narrative are reflected in their case. Families often complained that disappearances were not taken seriously by the police during the critical first days. For the Jacks, the RCMP prematurely announced that the family had been found. That mistake deprived them of the timely investigation most needed for recovery. Compare that to many accounts from families of missing women along Highway 16 who recalled similar slow or dismissive responses. Each case might differ in detail, but the systemic barrier repeated across them. Indigenous people vanished, and urgency was often absent in the pursuit of answers. For this reason, the Jack family's disappearance became more than an isolated tragedy. It represented the overlapping layers of trauma, vulnerability, and institutional neglect that defined the Highway of Tears. When activists spoke about the crisis, they did not only name the women who went missing while hitchhiking, they pointed to the Jacks too, as evidence that even full households could be erased under the same shadow of systemic failure. The uniqueness of their loss, 2 parents and 2 boys, made it resonate powerfully. It broadened the perception of who could be at risk. Their absence over the years kept the pressure alive. Families of Highway of Tears victims often joined together to advocate for recognition, better transportation, and greater attention to missing persons. The Jacks' relatives spoke out, reminding people that their tragedy connected to every other name tied to Highway 16. While Russell and Ryan's disappearance as children stood apart from the young women most often remembered, their loss reinforced the larger call for change. A safer transportation system might have reduced the family's reliance on a stranger's vehicle. A more urgent early police response might have boosted the chance of discovery. Both failures highlighted why activism was needed and why systemic change mattered. After their vanishing, the story of Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan circulated alongside the dozens of other names tied to Highway 16. The difference was scale. They were not just one person missing, they were 4. The silence left in their community was multiplied, not only in grief, but in symbolic weight. Their absence grew into one of the most enduring reminders of how deep the crisis of disappearances truly ran. The Jack family's case remains lodged in public memory because it expands the narrative from individuals to entire families, emphasizing that no one was immune. The vanishing of the Jacks became an enduring symbol of the Highway of Tears tragedy, reminding everyone that the risks of neglect, isolation, and systemic inequality did not strike according to age or gender alone. They marked the devastating possibility that an entire family could disappear in one night and be left unfound for decades. The family's absence has fueled decades of advocacy. How do families sustain hope with decades of silence? For the Jack family's relatives, especially Ronald's mother Mabel, this question shaped daily life after 1989. She often spoke about how much her son wanted steady work and how deeply he felt the weight of being unable to provide. To her, the decision to accept the stranger's offer at the pub was not reckless. She saw it as a move made by a desperate man trying to lift his family out of hardship. That understanding, however, did not shield her or others from the pain that followed when Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan disappeared without leaving answers behind. What families confront after a disappearance is not only grief but uncertainty. Loved ones may imagine different outcomes, each one bringing its own kind of anguish. Did something violent happen to the Jacks the night they left? Were they tricked into travelling somewhere remote and then silenced? Without proof, speculation fills the gap, and families have to live with scenarios instead of facts. This silence shapes collective memory, and for the Jacks' relatives, it created frustration with the way the investigation unfolded. They endured the police error in the earliest days of the search, when a false announcement claimed the family had been found safe. Moving forward from that mistake was never easy, because to them, it meant precious time had been lost that might have saved their lives or at least explained their absence. Those frustrations hardened into lasting feelings of neglect. Family members spoke out repeatedly over the years about their belief that authorities did not pursue the investigation with the urgency it deserved. They remained convinced that systemic indifference toward Indigenous families played a central role in how the search for the Jacks was handled. It was not simply a matter of police resources. To them, the silence around updates and the slow pace of follow-up demonstrated unequal treatment in comparison to other missing persons cases happening in Canada around the same years. But silence from investigators did not mean silence from the family. Ronald and Doreen's relatives kept speaking publicly. By doing so, they kept the mystery alive in the eyes of the community. Each interview, each appearance, and every reminder in print or on television worked to prevent the disappearance from fading out of memory. When anniversaries arrived the 5th year, the 10th, the 25th family members reminded the public that the search was still active and that behind the headlines were 2 parents and 2 children whose lives had been taken away from those who loved them. This persistence also connected with Indigenous advocacy across British Columbia and Canada. The Jack family's experience became part of wider calls for justice in missing and murdered Indigenous cases. Advocates stressed that systemic neglect was not an abstract problem. It resulted in families like the Jacks left without clear answers and without confidence in support from the agencies tasked with protecting them. The scale of disappearances along Highway 16, remembered as the Highway of Tears, meant the Jack story fit inside a painful national narrative. Their disappearance stood not only as a personal loss, but also as evidence that broader changes were necessary. Community efforts helped carry the story forward. Documentaries began to cover the Jack case as part of wider presentations on Highway 16. These productions gave space to family members to share memories of Ronald, of Doreen, and of their children. The goal was not only to describe the mystery, but to preserve their humanity. By speaking about who the Jacks were before their disappearance, the projects ensured they were seen as more than just names on a file. Social media later provided another platform, allowing advocates and community members to continue drawing attention to the case long after mainstream headlines had died out. These posts circulated photos, case summaries, and appeals for information that reached audiences across Canada and beyond. For the family itself, the loss did not end with one generation. Generational grief shaped their lives. Children who were cousins or nieces and nephews of Russell and Ryan grew up hearing about the disappearance. The memory of the Jacks became part of their identity, a reminder of how their family had been fractured by the events of 1989. Trauma in such families is not temporary. It weaves itself into family stories, traditions, and the way people approach the world around them. Each new generation carries that silence forward, both as pain and as motivation to keep searching for answers. In public, the family maintained clarity about what they believed mattered. Time and again, they reminded others not to be distracted by sensational theories involving serial killers. While some members of the public linked the disappearance to high-profile names like Robert Picton, the family reiterated that these links were unproven and unhelpful. To them, one truth stood above speculation. Ronald met a man at the pub who offered him work, and that was the last confirmed contact the family had before they vanished. Everything pointed back to that moment. The stranger in the bar remained central and remained real. Chasing legends about distant criminals only shifted focus away from the specific person who had been sitting across from Ronald, sharing drinks and making promises. This insistence on truth over myth kept the investigation's core alive. Journalists returning to the case decades later repeated the family's message. If the man at the pub could be named, then understanding might finally follow. By anchoring the story in that encounter, the family and their supporters preserved its focus, even when other theories tried to widen it into unsolvable territory. The persistence of loved ones has been the reason the Jack family remains present in public discussion today. Without their voices, the case might have been absorbed into the general shadow of the Highway of Tears. Instead, it has continued to stand out. More than 30 years later, Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan are still invoked in national discussions about missing Indigenous people. Their family, their names, and their fate are pressed into awareness by relatives who never accepted silence as an answer. That persistence is the mini payoff in a story otherwise filled with unanswered questions. Because their relatives refused to stop speaking, the disappearance of the Jacks did not vanish with them. It stayed alive in public memory, preserved not only in official police records, but in the collective awareness of people across British Columbia and Canada. These efforts ensured that while the investigation stumbled, forgetfulness would not erase their existence. And yet, after decades of sustained memory, the Jacks case is still unresolved. The silence that began in 1989 has stretched forward, untouched by resolutions or confirmed discoveries. Each retelling reinforces the unresolved nature of the story while sustaining its presence. What remains is a community living with the unanswered questions, and a family carrying grief that has crossed generations. Decades of unanswered questions leave the case unresolved, but unforgettable. What does it mean for an entire family to remain missing? Most disappearances involve an individual. A young woman who never makes it home. A man who leaves for work and fails to return. People vanish every year, and those stories leave behind holes for loved ones. But when the Jacks disappeared, it was not one person. It was 4 members of the same family, taken out of daily life in a single night. More than 3 decades later, nothing has been confirmed about their fate. No bodies, no possessions, not a trace. The silence surrounding them has left the case frozen, as though time itself stopped on that August night in 1989. This is the nature of the mystery. Their last known hours are clear enough. Ronald meeting a man in a bar, telling relatives about the job, preparing to leave with Doreen and the boys, and stepping into a pickup truck after midnight. After that, nothing. There are no bank withdrawals, there are no employment records, no phone calls, no sightings. People disappear for many reasons, but often investigators can trace a departure through paper trails or accidents that eventually show up. Here, it is as if the Jacks erased themselves from every system the moment they left their front door. It is the lack of traceability at every level that makes this case so haunting. When families disappear in stories of conflict or disaster, there are sometimes remains to account for their lives. There are names etched into archives or items left behind that speak for them. In the case of the Jacks, the overnight erasure leaves almost nothing. It can be difficult to imagine how 4 people, 2 adults and 2 children, could vanish without evidence. Some missing people are folded into public systems through school enrollments, hospital visits, paychecks, or welfare interactions. For the Jacks, all of that ended at once. Government records that should show signs of their lives, like school attendance or medical treatments, stopped completely after August 1989. The family has been suspended in absence ever since, their place in everyday registers of life gone overnight. The investigation remains open. That fact matters. Even decades later, law enforcement will confirm that the Jack family's case has not been closed. Files have been revisited, tips continue to be received, and the anonymous phone call from 1996 remains inside the records. But an open file without resolution also highlights the frustration. People know the family is missing. Authorities acknowledge the facts, but there has never been enough detail to move it from mystery into tragedy with clarity. The open case represents not only a desire to keep searching, but also an admission of defeat that for 30 years, investigators have held no solid ground to stand on. For the families left behind, this suspension places grief into limbo. When a loved one dies, even under difficult circumstances, rituals and mourning allow families to begin moving forward. When someone is missing, those processes cannot begin in the same way. The Jack family's relatives had to live with the uncertainty. They could not bury them. They could not know whether to grieve or continue to hope. Living between those states is exhausting, and that exhaustion has stretched across generations. Ronald's mother, brothers, nieces, and nephews all carried the weight. For the children of that extended family, the story of the disappearance became part of the memory they inherited. It pulled trauma forward, shaping their experiences, even though many were too young to remember Ronald and Doreen themselves. The cultural impact has been significant as well. As Indigenous people of British Columbia, the Jack family's disappearance ties into a larger story of systemic loss. The Highway of Tears stands as a corridor linked with dozens of disappearances, most involving Indigenous women. The Jacks became part of that narrative, a reminder that entire units of family life could be destroyed by neglect and violence. Their absence highlights generational trauma, not only from the possibility of crime, but also from inadequate answers. In communities already marked by the history of residential schools, the loss of 4 more members under unexplained conditions strikes at the heart of cultural continuity. The Jacks' disappearance is not just a family's grief, it is part of what Indigenous activists describe as collective loss, where silence from authorities mirrors the erasures long experienced in their histories. For many, The Jack family is remembered not as individuals, but as a symbol of uncertainty. They became part of the broader pattern of missing Indigenous persons in Canada. Families folded into statistics and lists of unresolved cases. But it is vital to remember there were real children here. Russell was 9 years old, Ryan was 4. When their names vanish into the official record, the human scale can be overlooked. To say an entire family disappeared is to simplify the reality of 2 boys with friends, parents, and futures that never continued. It is one thing for an individual life to be suspended, it is another for childhoods to evaporate in silence, leaving no sign of growth, no photographs beyond 1989. The tension of their disappearance rests in these unanswered details. Who exactly drove the truck? Did the camp by Klukul's Lake ever exist? Was the anonymous caller speaking truth about a ranch burial, or was it manipulation? Every question exists in possibility, but none have been resolved. For those who live with the story, this constant speculation becomes its own form of suffering. They cannot rest in certainty, because every corner of the case leads to another what if. In turn, the Jacks are carved into public history, not through discovery, but through absence. What does justice look like when the trail is this cold? That question underscores the story now. There will always be the sense that if the initial handling by police had been different, the outcome might have shifted. If the error of prematurely declaring the family found had not drained precious momentum, perhaps clues could have led to recovery. If investigations had spanned ranch properties more aggressively, maybe the words of the anonymous caller would have been tested more fully. Instead, the reality is that 30 years later, the physical world holds no clear sign of the Jacks. Justice is murky when not even the truth of the crime is known. As years pass, memories fade, and potential witnesses age and die. Each decade reduces the chance of fresh discovery. What remains instead are stories told within families, and the cultural resonance that keeps the lost part of collective awareness. The Jacks remain frozen at the point of their disappearance, unaged and incomplete. They are remembered as they looked the day they left. Ronald and Doreen as a young couple, Russell as a boy of 9, Ryan as a 4-year-old child. To their relatives, they are fixed this way. To the public, they are the embodiment of an unresolved case stretched across generations. The Jack family's disappearance is not only a mystery, but a symbol of unanswered questions that refuse to fade. It represents the failures of an investigative system, the vulnerabilities of Indigenous families, and the cost of silence extended over lifetimes. The file remains open because nothing can be proven, but that open status is itself a weight. It means that resolution is still possible, but each year makes it less likely. And this unresolved ending is the lasting weight of their disappearance. Jack family's disappearance shows how desperation can reshape judgment. Faced with poverty, unemployment, and trauma, Ronald and Doreen placed their trust in a stranger who seemed to offer hope. That choice reflects the vulnerability many families face when the safety net of society fails them. This case remains unsolved. More than 3 decades later, there are still no answers, no remains, and no closure for their loved ones. Their story highlights systemic neglect and the dangers faced by Indigenous families. After all these years, Ronald, Doreen, Russell, and Ryan remain missing, one of Canada's most enduring and haunting mysteries.